Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, participants joining us from across the globe. As we can see, I am Victoria Tuamisto. I'm a program officer here at the Trade Facilitation and Policy for Business section at the International Trade Center. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this first session of a three-part webinar series hosted by the International Center, focusing on unpacking the European Union's green initiatives. Now, these forward-looking and interactive webinars are aiming to tackle one of the burning issues of today for governments, enterprises, civil society, and these are namely the opportunities and challenges inherent in the policies and regulatory measures on environmental sustainability, climate resilience, and the wider green transition. Now, the objective of these webinars is to help you, policymakers, businesses, and the trading community in developing countries in particular, to gain awareness, to understand, to adopt, and to adapt to the trade impacts that these various initiatives that will be presented over the course of the webinar series will produce. Now, over the next 2 hours, we will have practitioners, experts from ITCs and ITC's network of experts to present these initiatives and their own work in the field, and to share ideas on policy reforms and particular strategies for advocacy, for compliance, and on enhancing business competitiveness at large. Now, to start us off today, I would like to give the virtual floor to the Senior Advisor in the Trade Facilitation and Policy for Business section, Monsieur Jean-Sébastien Roure, who leads ITC's work on trade policy in this space. And over to you, Jean-Sébastien, to provide the opening remarks and guide us into the conversation today.
Thank you, Victoria, and good day, everyone. And first, let me thank you for joining us today. So climate change is a cross-cutting development issue affecting almost every aspect of sustainable development. It is altering the ecological and social system that underpin human well-being and economic activities. Developing countries are particularly vulnerable to its impact on growth and sustainable development prospects. As a result, climate change is now one of the defining elements of the development agenda. And so the time is now to act on the plans and make strides towards a green and sustainable economy. In any case, this change is inevitable. And so it is important for countries to take action in this regard. Trade is a pivotal instrument for creating policies and regulations that set the framework conditions to usher in a green economy and foster green trade opportunities for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Efforts are indeed ramping up at the multilateral, regional, and national levels to solidify the links between trade and environment, to green trade policy instruments, and promote sustainable trade. The International Trade Center seeks to contribute to these efforts from the lens of the MSMEs, with the objective of supporting MSMEs to position itself within the green transition, access opportunities, and not be left behind. ITC SMEs Competitiveness 2021 on empowering the green recovery analyzed the mechanisms required to foster competitive, resilient, and environmentally sustainable SMEs. The perception among SMEs is that the green transition challenges their ability to retain market access and explore broader trade opportunities. And as a result, they will be left behind. However, with environmental sustainability and climate resilience becoming key determinants of enterprise competitiveness, it is increasingly important for MSMEs to understand, adapt to, and leverage opportunities in green trade. As with any change, there is a considerable effort required on the part of the public and private sector stakeholders to come to terms with the new realities and take the necessary measures to bring into actions and adapt to these changes. The International Trade Center is supporting SMEs to adapt to the inevitable transition and working with governments to set in place the regulatory, policy, and institutional frameworks to create a conducive business environment for these SMEs to strive. Today's webinar, which is the first of a three-part series, will unpack selected EU's green initiatives and discussed how this will impact trade and the existing and potential future challenges faced by SMEs in this regard. The European Union has made several pioneering steps towards facilitating this green transition and has been at the forefront of using trade as a tool to bring about this change. These measures are being reviewed by other jurisdictions as benchmarks from which to develop their own green policy frameworks. As a result, this webinar series seeks to bring to light these various aspects of the green transition by drawing from the EU's efforts. At the same time, the EU is also still developing, re-evaluating, and refining their green policies. And so, by raising awareness and educating SMEs and policy officials in developing countries, the hope is to empower developing countries to also be able to be part of the negotiating table and contribute to policy formulation on these issues. Today, the webinar will focus on introducing stakeholders to the various EU green initiatives and regulatory developments and the resulting impact on SMEs' trade and access to the EU markets. The following two webinars will then delve into the issues surrounding, one, the carbon transition and addressing resulting barriers to trade, and two, leveraging with trade and investment policies to facilitate the transition to a green economy. Thank you all, the panelists and the participants who have joined us today again, and looking forward to a good discussion. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Jean-Sébastien, for setting the scene and the key themes for today, as well as for the ensuing two webinars. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to two experts from ITC Network, Mr. Paolo Vergano and Mr. Tobias Dolle. Paolo is a partner at Fratini Vergano, a practice that specializes in European and international trade law. And Mr. Dolle is a senior associate from Fratini Vergano as well. Now, Paolo and Tobias will deliver a keynote presentation and an overview of the EU initiatives that will be under discussion today. And with that, Paolo and Tobias, over to you.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. First of all, allow me to express our gratitude for the ITC to have invited us as presenters. I should say that as passionate trade lawyers who care deeply about sustainability, and as we all do about the environment, this was a good challenge for us. And as I hope you will see from our presentation, we are trying to connect some of the dots between the policies being increasingly adopted, particularly by the European Union, which is a leader in this respect, in relation to sustainability, environmental protection, the circular economy, and other important policies, and the impact on trade, the impact on countries trading with the European Union, particularly developing countries, and the impact on traders from those countries and around the world that are going to be impacted. So the toolbox we are presenting today is a run-through at an introductory level of the key initiatives by the European Union, the type and methodology of actions that both countries, particularly developing countries and traders, should follow in order to understand the new policies, the new initiatives, engage early, comply, and advocate for certain solutions, and where possible, introduce and be part of trade facilitative solutions. That, I think, is the overall purpose, but allow me to start. Tobias, if you could go through the first slide. Yeah, so to do that, we'll take you through three key initiatives by the European Union: the European Green Deal, as it is known, the Farm to Fork strategy, and the Fit for 55 scheme and strategy. We will then zoom in on a number of specific tools and regulatory initiatives and legislative initiatives that stem from those big initiatives. We will drive through, again, the methodology that we are proposing. And this is proposed on the basis of our experience working both with governments and private stakeholders to deal with this new phenomena in terms of the regulation and legislation. And then we'll reach a number of conclusions. The next, please. Yeah, please. So a word of caution, if you will, in terms of the trade perspective on these instruments. Clearly, these instruments meet a pressing need, and we've heard it from the introduction, of countries around the world. In this case, the zoom is on the European Union, and the European Union has embarked on a very ambitious set of initiatives, green initiatives. But the typical approaches, as you know very well, I'm sure, are those of addressing these issues multilaterally. So within the multilateral fora that exist, that is and should be the preferred approach always, because multilateralism delivers, of course, shared objectives, shared tools, and aligned policies by countries. It is not easy, of course, to achieve, and often, since it requires consensus, it remains elusive. The second best is regionalism and or bilateral deals that allow some regulation as opposed to none, or as opposed to the purely unilateral approach. This comes with some baggage, of course, because the more bilateral and regional umbrella of regulations develop, the more the spaghetti bowl. So the more the compliance and the complexity, especially for medium and small-sized enterprises or micro enterprises, to try and understand them and comply with. Finally, unilateralism, which is what we are seeing increasingly. Countries become tired of waiting for that elusive multilateral approach. Something must be done. Increasingly, that something to be done is perceived as urgent. And so unilateralism, for instance, as we will take you through the EU policies, is both the third best, but also the reality we are confronted with. And consider also that this is not a novelty. I mean, there are a number of regulations, directives, initiatives, as we will show you, that are being engineered. There is many that have already been in place for a while, and we'll come to those. The next slide, please. When we talk about the European Union, of course, consider that it is a regional platform and a common internal market of 27 member states, one that has notoriously a power of attraction in terms of guiding the development of similar policies and initiatives in other countries, in those that are the most integrated with the European Union. So not just the 27 members of the European Union, but countries in the European Economic Area, others, for instance, those of the Central European Free Trade Agreement, and many more. So the importance of starting this work and review from the European Union is not only in the fact that the European Union is at the forefront of this type of initiatives, but it is also a block that in a good way informs and inspires many others, and because of the size of the market is able to attract and push harmonization of standards across the globe. So there is a benefit also for businesses knowing that they'll be able to trade with 27 EU member states, having to comply with a single set of requirements and having access to a big market. That's the carrot, of course. There are also sticks in this game, and we'll come to those later on. The next slide, please. Now, this is the little methodological approach that I mentioned earlier, and that we will come back to towards the end of the presentation. we propose and we apply, in fact, when we work with governments or private parties to deal with this new phenomenon, with the green initiatives, but arguably this could be applied to any regulatory initiative. It is important to be aware of the developments. So understanding the regulation or the legislation being proposed and under consideration, being developed, assessing early on the impact on trade of those initiatives, of those new rules and requirements. Sometimes this is not easy. And there is an impact, of course, onto countries. There is impact onto sectors down to specific companies and operators. Where is the initiative at any point in time? Especially in the EU, the legislative and regulatory processes do not occur overnight. It takes months or years. And throughout that production chain, there is many entry points to engage, to let the positions know, to try and ensure that the impacts be minimized, understood and minimized. That's what we call advocacy. So there are many such opportunities within the EU process, which is to a large degree transparent, based on due process, accessible to all countries and operators alike, domestic and foreign. And so this is the time when changes can be brought, legislation can be improved, impacts on trade can be minimized. After that comes compliance. And compliance entails, obviously, actions by the operators, that those that will be affected because of the products they trade and those products being covered by the new initiatives or the new rules. There are also, and these are fundamental, actions to be taken early by governments of the exporting countries to ensure that their policies, their measures are tweaked and aligned as much as possible to those of important importing countries like the European Union. And finally, last but not least, there is the whole element and dimension of trade facilitation that comes typically through negotiation. It rests on a good understanding of the previous points and a good engagement in the previous stages of this process. And that may allow, and often does allow, a good degree of facilitation, minimizing the hurdles, the requirements, the burden, the costs, and also scoring points and gaining advantages vis-a-vis competitors. Those that move fast and early will have earlier preferential market access, in this case, to the European Union. So that's the process we always engage with, and we would suggest, of course, to be considered, and we'll show you in the application to specific policies as we go on. The next slide, please. So for developing countries, obviously, this is very relevant. To understand and know and be aware of the legislative and regulatory developments is fundamental, because these initiatives will already have often a direct impact on trade and on their ability to access the European market. As I said, compliance will allow continued access to a very important and lucrative and stable market like that of the European Union. Fast movers, those that are quickly off the blocks with ingenuity, with creativity sometimes, may also draw comparative advantages vis-a-vis their competitors, other exporters to the EU, which not yet are able to comply. And as I said, concerted actions between policymakers on one end and the private sector in the exporting countries, especially in developing countries, is something that may contribute towards those goals. And consider that these initiatives we are seeing piloted in the EU, as I mentioned, are inevitably going to have dominoes effects internationally. Global standards are being established, and they're being shaped to a large degree by the countries that are at the forefront of these processes of regulation. The next slide. So what I would like to do now quickly is just to show you that this is not science fiction. This has happened already over the course of the last decade, in fact, in increasing form, and it is now accelerating, as my colleague Tobias will show you when we look at the green initiatives, 360 degrees. But a number of EU policies and regulations that have been in place are easy to show you the trade impacts and the need for early engagement. To do that, I will look at FLAGD, as it is known, so the regulation on timber legality and products, the Renewable Energy Directive, RED, the regulation on fishery products, that which tries to ensure that no illegal, unreported, or unregulated fisheries be traded with the European Union, and the regulation on certain single-use plastics, the SUP directive. The next one, Tobias, and quickly, so that I can give you time to cover the green initiatives. The FLAGD scheme has been around for quite some time, and it aims at combating illegal logging, preserving forests and related environments, knowing that reducing illegal logging by strengthening sustainable and legal forest management, improving governance, and promoting trade in legally produced timber is an important objective, and one that the EU has been very quick off the blocks in trying to achieve. The trade impacts are clear. Imports into the EU of illegally harvested timber are prohibited. There are obligations on operators, so private stakeholders that deal in these products and that export to the EU to have due diligence safeguards in place. Those, of course, are costly, but they also open up a market which is very lucrative. The EU has engaged with countries, developing countries, sometimes with success, sometimes with more problems, to achieve voluntary partnership agreements that would allow for the domestic policies of those countries to be aligned with those of the EU, systems of licensing be put in place, trade facilitation to be achieved. And those legal frameworks require policy changes at the national level. So both governments and private operators, as you can see, have to be involved, have to be part of the engagement with the EU, have to be part of a solution, which sometimes gives considerable market access advantages to those that hold the FLAGD licenses and comply with the legality due diligence requirements. The next example, Renewable Energy Directive. This is an important set of regulations and directives by the EU that aim at reducing the use of fossil fuels and shifting to renewable energy forms in a number of sectors, particularly in the transport sector, aiming at increasing the percentage of energy consumption coming from renewable energy sources, defining in the process a series of sustainability and greenhouse gas emission criteria that the fuels, the renewable energy needs to display. These, as you can see, set standards. They set sometimes technical regulations, mandatory standards that will in turn create a market, that of renewable energy fuels, and also give access to support schemes, i.e. subsidies for those players. Yeah, so incredible economic impacts, because it does create a market that otherwise wouldn't be able to survive or to have room on the market by itself. This requires certification requirements, requires a lot of compliance, a lot of work to understand the policies and comply with. And you should know that in the case of the Renewable Energy Directive, certain aspects have been considered problematic and controversial by some developing countries, and there is even WTO dispute settlement ongoing, which shows that when certain elements and the engagement with a country that proposes and adopts measures is not ideal, may lead to dispute settlement, may lead to friction, may lead to trade irritants and perceived barriers. So Again, all of that is in the example we have before us and in reality. The next example, that of IUU, as it is known, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And here, of course, the objective of the EU to ensure that there is no unsustainable exploitation of living aquatic resources is based on tools that essentially boil down to the issuance of catch certificates by the states, the countries where the fisheries activities are conducted. Those have to be in line with EU requirements. There are processes of policy alignment, of discussion, and ultimately the impacts on trade are clear. Only marine fishery products that benefit and can display those catch certificates will be able to be traded in and with the EU. There are systems to yellow card, so to give warnings to certain countries that don't comply with these requirements. If the engagement with those countries does not lead to addressing those problems, there are red flags, which are, of course, dramatic in terms of trade. They mean the inability to continue trading with the European Union. And so you can see that the impacts can be drastic. The next one, please. Right, so plastics, I only very quickly want to point you to the fact that if you look at the list of products that are affected by the single-use directive and that impose a number of labeling requirements, requirements to be used in the design of the products, this is a long list, and a lot of different parts of the economy and of the supply chains are affected. So I stop there because Tobias will come back to this. These were some examples to show you that this has been happening. Now we look at some of the more recent green initiatives. Tobias, on to you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Paolo. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll continue right away so that we can move forward with the presentation. As Paolo mentioned when giving the overview of the presentation, we'll now have a look at the broader initiatives before then zooming into a number of specific legal instruments where we'll provide you with a bit of a greater overview and a look at the impact on trade. We will be looking at three broader initiatives that the European Union has launched in recent years: the European Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, which is more focused on food and agriculture, and the Fit for 55 package, which is more geared towards climate change and reducing emissions towards climate neutrality. So those three initiatives are interconnected, they are linked, they're Farm to Fork and Fit for 55 are closely linked to the European Green Deal, but they're separate initiatives that we shall review and discuss. The European Green Deal is an initiative that was presented by the European Union in December 2019, aimed at setting policy initiatives, making the European Union's economy sustainable, more circular, and overall climate neutral by 2050. It is, after all, a growth strategy, allowing certain business sectors, certain sectors of the economy to grow, to transform towards a climate neutral, fair, and prosperous society, achieving a sustainable green transition in the European Union, and by that, having global impacts on traders and businesses. It has massive implications, and we'll shortly see why, leading to both changes in production and supply chain strategies around the world. Brief overview of the objectives and the scope of the European Green Deal. It looks at environmental aspects, fresh air, clean water. It looks at healthy and affordable food, and we'll get to that when we look at the Farm to Fork strategy. It looks at cleaner energy, clean technological innovation. That is something that we'll look at when we get to Fit for 55. It looks at individual products, longer lasting products that can be recycled and reused, and the Single-Use Plastics Directive is one of the key examples of initiatives in that regard. And it also wants to ensure a globally competitive and resilient industry in the European Union. So level playing fields and working for this transition for European businesses, which businesses around the world need to be aware of and compete with. Zooming in on some of the key areas of action under the European Green Deal, and these are just examples. The list is much, much longer. We have the Circular Economy Action Plan, under which also the plastics initiatives fall. We have the biodiversity strategy that has an impact on certain products. We have a chemicals strategy for sustainable chemicals that affect the chemical sector. We have proposals to stop deforestation, and that will be one of the examples that we're looking at later on. We have the European Battery Alliance modernizing EU legislation on batteries. So you can see the scope is broad, the scope is wide. It affects a large range of products when they are to be placed on the European market, produced in a certain way. Zooming in even more on specific legislative initiatives, we see again the example of the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive, a legal instrument that is already in place and that businesses already need to comply with. But there are a number of legislative initiatives still in the pipeline. There is a proposal for substantiating green claims made by companies, addressing labeling issues on products to address and combat greenwashing. So if a green claim is made on a product, the business making that claim must be able to substantiate it. Very recently, the European Union has presented its strategy for sustainable textiles, something that will become very relevant in the coming years, entirely requiring textile products to use recycled fibers in the textile products. And one more initiative that we shall zoom in even further later on is the Eco-Design Directive, aimed at making products more sustainable, linking product requirements and labeling requirements to certain products. Part of the European Green Deal is the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, with a clear focus on food and agriculture, aimed at really redesigning food system, establishing sustainable food systems, looking at good agricultural practices, food security, food safety, making food production, food processing, and food consumption more sustainable. And again, we have a huge list of initiatives, a broad scope, covering pretty much anything that you can imagine when it comes to food and agricultural production, from animal welfare to food labeling, alcoholic beverages labeling, pesticides, the sustainable use of pesticides, the issue of feed additives for animal feed, animal nutrition, and then when it comes to the marketing of food, a revision of the EU rules on food contact materials, and looking at the agricultural production, the revision of EU marketing standards. So again, these are only examples from an even longer list, highlighting the key areas in which the EU is legislating and conducting reforms in view of these green initiatives. Fit for 55 is a rather recent initiative building on the European climate law that sets a target for climate neutrality by 2050. And on the road to this objective of climate neutrality, the European Union has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 when compared to 1990 levels. So for this intermediate objective, the Fit for 55 strategy provides for a number of initiatives to pursue this objective. focusing on energy, obviously energy efficiency, renewable energy, and Paolo mentioned earlier on the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, which has rules on transport. We have energy taxation here, a more domestic issue. And one thing that we shall be zooming in later on is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the so-called CBAM, which will soon apply to a range of products when placed on the EU market. Again, snapshot of some of the proposals and initiatives under the Fit for 55. It's an initiative that largely builds on existing legislation, reviewing and revising, updating the existing legislation, but also proposing new and innovative legal instruments. And one of the key initiatives that has already gained a lot of international attention is indeed the proposal for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, zooming in even more on some of those green initiatives, and we have selected initiatives that we consider will have a significant impact on trade and are therefore of particular relevance for developing countries and businesses in developing countries. From those various initiatives, we try to identify a number of clusters to organize the various initiatives, given that the broader initiatives are interconnected and linked. And we suggest to look at the cluster of sustainable products, so where product requirements are being amended, are being set, requirements that products that are to be placed on the European Union's market must be complied with. We have the cluster of sustainable supply chains and the big issue of due diligence obligations for businesses based and operating in the European Union. And we have the big cluster of climate change mitigation measures, measures that aim at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and pursuing the overall EU objective of attaining climate neutrality. In this introductory webinar today, we're only able to scratch the surface, have a relatively superficial look at these clusters, but there will be 2 more webinars going forward where we'll be having much more time on those clusters and can conduct more detailed reviews and recommendations for action during those more specialized webinars. The first cluster, sustainable products, we have clustered here the various initiatives on green claims, sustainable textiles, requirements on packaging and packaging waste. And one initiative that I'd like to provide some more details is the very recent proposal on the new Eco-Design Directive, which intends to make sustainable products the norm in the European Union, which means they should be environmentally friendly, circular, energy efficient throughout their whole life cycle, and be recyclable, be repairable, so that products do not need to be disposed of, can be used, reused, recycled. For that to happen, all products falling under the scope of the regulation, and incidentally, it will apply to almost all physical goods placed on the EU market. All those products will have to be accompanied by a digital product passport, which is intended to make it easier to repair and recycle the product. And that is something that is to be checked upon importation into the European Union. And the relevant rules will be subject to labeling requirements, for example, when it comes to the repairability of products. Obviously, these rules will have a significant impact on trade, as it will apply to most physical products placed on the EU market, including imported products. There's an issue of labeling. There's the issue of the digital product passport. And all of these rules can be considered as technical regulations, which means that conformity must be achieved with the rules of the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade. This is an initiative that was presented only a couple of days ago at the end of March. We expect that a public consultation and feedback periods will soon be launched by the European Union, providing important opportunities for governments and traders around the world to provide their positions and views. And then the European institutions will need to agree on a final text, which could still be adopted during the course of the year. So this is still under discussion. There's still a chance to convey positions, but it is in the pipeline and the rules will apply in the near future. Sustainable supply chains. This is an important issue that has been under discussion for quite a few months now for everything that is due diligence when it comes to corporate sustainability and the issue of deforestation and forest degradation. There are two separate proposals, one for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, largely already linked to existing legislation in certain EU member states. And secondly, the European Union has published a proposal for regulation on market access conditions for certain commodities and products that are associated with deforestation and forest degradation. On corporate sustainability, this is a directive that will require EU member states to set rules on due diligence obligations for businesses. So businesses operating in the European Union must integrate due diligence obligations into their business practices, must aim at identifying actual or potential adverse impacts on human rights and the environment. There will be a complaints procedure allowing individuals and associations to complain against individual companies. Companies would be required to monitor the effectiveness of their policies and to communicate on their steps to ensure due diligence. There is obviously a certain burden that comes with those obligations, many requirements that business operators have to comply with. There is the issue of inadvertent discrimination because it will only apply to large companies at the beginning, but also to smaller companies that operate in certain what the European Union considers risk sectors. And importantly, all those rules will apply throughout the supply chains. So an economic operator on the European Union market needs to ensure that all the businesses within its global supply chains contribute to those due diligence objectives and ensure that no adverse effects on human rights and the environment occur. Again, it is a relatively recent proposal published earlier this year in February. Currently, a public consultation is ongoing. So until the end of May, stakeholders around the world can contribute, can convey their views to the European Union on this proposal. And then EU institutions are to agree on a text that will then become law. Secondly, and briefly, there's a second proposal on the table for with respect to deforestation and forest degradation. 6 products, 6 sectors that the EU associates with deforestation and forest degradation will be subject to additional requirements. This concerns wood, cattle, soy, palm oil, coffee, and cocoa. And those products that come from certain countries will be subject to additional rules. Due diligence obligations apply and will vary depending on a risk classification, that is a country risk classification. The European Union will classify all global countries as low risk, standard risk, and high risk. And depending on the risk, the due diligence obligations will vary, will be stricter depending on the associated risk. Again, there will be an administrative and cost burden for companies in order to achieve those objectives. There is perhaps a potential advantage for countries and sectors that already implement stringent rules and that can comply from day one with those requirements. And given the restricted scope on 6 product sectors, there may be a risk of inadvertent discrimination vis-a-vis other sectors. Again, this is still at the proposal stage. The proposal is on the table, is being discussed. The other EU institutions, the European Parliament, the Council of the EU are currently deliberating their positions. And during the course of the year, will be expected to agree on a text that will become law and apply 1 year after its adoption. Finally, the third cluster, very quickly, before I hand back to Paolo for some more methodological aspects, the cluster of climate change mitigation, where we shall zoom in briefly on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which aims at ensuring that the price of imports reflects more accurately the carbon content. It would cover both direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And importantly, there would be exemptions for third countries that have similar emission rules in place as the EU has. The basic idea here is that the European Union considers that it has already very stringent rules on greenhouse gas emissions to avoid carbon emissions, that not all third countries have similar rules, and which may provide a competitive advantage to their producers. And to level the playing field, the CBAM would come into play and require all EU importers to buy carbon certificates corresponding to the carbon price that would have been paid had the goods been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules and the EU legislation. This will add additional costs to imports of covered products unless exempted, and unless the non-EU producers can show that they have already domestically paid a similar price than would have applied in the European Union. Again, this is something at the proposal stage. It was proposed in the summer of last year. The discussions in the EU are ongoing. A text is to be adopted during the course of the year, and it can be expected that this will apply from the beginning of next year. So as you can see, there are a lot of initiatives in the pipeline, a lot of initiatives to be aware of and to take action. And with that, I hand over again to my colleague, Paolo.
Thank you, Tobias. Let me try to be quick on these points. If I could have the next slide, because we're running against our deadline. Having seen a number of policies already in place, having seen many that are being developed, and going back to our methodology, the first point is awareness. Government authorities must regularly review these developments, these legislative and regulatory developments. That can be done, of course, by having their antennas work effectively on the ground, their diplomatic missions, checking the notifications made by the EU to the WTO, checking processes of early engagement, impact assessment studies done by the EU, consultations done by the EU, which always precede the launch of legislative and regulatory processes. Private stakeholders also can and should play an important role here. They need to work with their importers in the EU, their customers, consultants, advisors, trade associations, business councils, to have early warning of these new legislative and regulatory initiatives and monitor things regularly. Also, institutions like the ITC and others do a great deal of work in this line of engagement and can play an important role. The next slide and the next point in the methodology, early assessment. An early assessment and analysis of the potential impacts. Some of the questions that have been coming in from participants show exactly that. And the sectors we've heard already being covered, those that may be added. I should say that, for example, on deforestation and forest degradation, on top of the sectors that Tobias referred to, we know that there is now a parliamentary process unfolding in the EU, and others may be added to the list. Tobacco, maize, rubber. Yeah, this is an evolving process, and one that also evolves in terms of the potential impact. So keeping an eye on things, assessing both the potential negative impacts, so the restrictions, the requirements, the costs, the compliance and due diligence engagement, but also what are the possible positive impacts. Has our government, has our industry, our sector harmonized towards those requirements and standards? Can we do so? Can we put something in place to achieve that regulatory convergence, policy changes in our own domestic jurisdiction so that our products will have a comparative advantage in accessing the EU market? And this is also for developing countries to establish and also to engage with the EU, to let the EU know of the special differential needs of developing countries and of their industry. The next slide, please. The next, yeah. So monitoring, as we said, as this process unfolds, new elements will become available, new studies, new assessments. There are an awful lot of different levels of engagement in the EU legislative and regulatory process, be it by the European Commission, which has the initiative, the European Parliament, which provides the venue where a lot of these policies are discussed, improved, sometimes worsened. But that process unfolds. The Council of the European Union, where the member states feed their positions and their requirements, plus obviously the discourse and the discussions at individual EU member states level. All of this needs to be monitored, because by understanding exactly where the EU is going, what are the problem areas, where are the entry points to engage, the next point, Tobias, which is advocacy, then can be played out. And advocacy means engaging both bilaterally, country to country, EU to exporting or developing country that is affected by this, or multilaterally, be that at the WTO or in some of the technical fora like FAO, OIE for animal health, IPPC for plant protection, ISO for other standards, in order to let the EU know of certain positions and do this technically. So, as I said, there are many of these entry points where submissions, inputs, non-papers, technical briefs, alternative measures that could be adopted to achieve the same legitimate objective, but while having less trade restrictive effects, can and should be made known to the EU. This process of advocacy is where some multinational corporations, some developing countries and third parties and trading partners of the EU engage, but very few and not very effectively. And this is the biggest opportunity and the biggest missed opportunity, we believe, in this process. The next comes obviously compliance. When the measure is adopted, compliance must be achieved, and compliance should not start on the day of adoption. The mechanisms should be understood and put in place so that the fast movers, as we call them, those that can move fast and early, will score comparative advantages in accessing the EU market. And there is an awful lot of work that goes with compliance. Compliance also requires from the government, the policymakers, the decision makers in the countries that are affected, changes in policies. to achieve legislative or regulatory convergence, to harmonize their standards to those of the EU which have been adopted. Last point, negotiation. And this, again, is something that I would encourage countries, but also the forces within those countries that are behind their governments to engage, to think out of the box, try to find solutions that can deliver trade facilitation as a way to mitigate the impacts on trade of these new policies. These solutions can be found and typically and ideally embodied in bilateral trade agreements between the European Union and third countries. This is where advantages can be achieved, trade facilitation can be obtained, and this is a way to also manage these green initiatives and their impacts on trade. I conclude. The next slide, please. Again, I think what needs to be underscored is the importance of applying that methodology of engaging early, of identifying the critical EU initiatives that matter to specific people, traders, operators, assessing early the impacts, and defining the trade strategies that should be then deployed in order to mitigate the impacts. The very last slide, and then I give it back to you, Victoria, with a thank you for your understanding in us having had a bit more time than scheduled. The idea that back at home, developing countries, policymakers, and private sector stakeholders need to act timely, effectively, and early in order to go through this methodology we have identified. This is an area where, of course, developing countries especially would need and typically do need a lot of support, dedicated capacity building and technical support from organizations such as the ITC. It is also important that what is done domestically enhances and is conducive to a solid business environment that can allow the private sector to comply, to score trade facilitation instrument, because at the end of the day, it is the private sector that will be impacted. At the end of the day, it is the private sector that can make the difference and also contribute domestically to social, economic development and ticking off all the other boxes which are important for sustainability. We stop there. Thank you very much for now, and we're ready to engage with you for a discussion and questions you may have. Victoria?
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you very much, Tobias, for this comprehensive overview of what might at times look like the EU's own spaghetti bowl of regulations, directives, initiatives. I think you've provided quite a bit of clarity on how the EU is approaching the subject and how, in particular, SMEs, businesses, and developing economies can now go through the steps and entry points that you discussed in actually understanding and having an impact also how these will take shape in the future. Now, there have been lots of questions throughout your presentation, and thank you for addressing some of those in real time. I'd say the questions are kind of relating to both sides of the coin that we mentioned at the beginning: the opportunities, the new markets, the inherent kind of positive direction of green transition, as well as then the challenges and concerns of businesses on how do we actually get to comply, demonstrate compliance, and take advantage of the opportunities that are presented through these initiatives. And perhaps here, I would like to open up already to the panel that is here present with us. So we have the great pleasure of welcoming Mr. Kemraj Ramphul, who is the Senior Advisor at ITC's Trade Facilitation and Policy for Business section, leading the work on export quality management here with us, as well as Mr. Chris Humphrey, who's the Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, who can provide obviously that perspective on the EU and ASEAN business relations and the impact and on trade and investment that those trade relations have. Perhaps here I would go over to you, Kemraj, first. Quite a few of the questions related to the ways in which SMEs in particular can take advantage, can better understand the rules regulations that have been presented, and specifically on the standards requirements, government regulations, EU regulations, and the voluntary standards that more and more businesses are feeling compelled to comply with. Could you talk a little bit about the particular EU standards requirements in our work that you feel and see developing countries already meeting, and companies and their capacity improving on this front, and where do you see those particular challenges as it relates to, in particular, EU requirements, but also beyond, if you would?
Okay, let me unmute first. Thank you, Victoria. Good day to all of the participants. As indicated in the presentation made by Paolo and Tobias, one of the key policy areas of the European Union is the farm-to-fork strategy. Achievement of a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. This strategy sets out both regulatory and non-regulatory initiatives to support the transition. And the targets for the farm-to-fork strategy include, this has been indicated during the presentation, reduction of the use and risk of chemical pesticides, reduction of use of fertilizers, transition of agricultural land to organic production. So to achieve these objectives, the EU is planning the revision of many existing regulations for food and agriculture, as well as the creation of new rules. Examples have been indicated by Tobias, the revision of sustainable use of pesticide directives, the revision of EU marketing standards for agricultural, fishery, and aquaculture products, revision of EU legislation on food contact materials. I'm just citing a few, but let me say that the EU is already leading in the pesticides control programs. It regularly reviews the use of authorized pesticides in light of scientific knowledge and phases out the products which are evaluated to have harmful effects on man and environment. And this is in line with the EU existing regulation on the EU regulation of 2009 concerning the placing of plant protection products on the market, and also the regulation of 2005 on maximum residual levels of pesticides in food or feed of plant and animal origin. These residual limits are continuously being reviewed in light of scientific evidence. And on the other side, the EU has come with stricter regulations on plant health as per the 2016 regulation, which requires a stronger control on plant pests and diseases. The new rules aim to modernize the plant health regime, enhancing more effective measures for the protection of the Union's territory and its plants. They also aim to ensure safe trade, as well as to mitigate the impacts of climate change on health of crops and forests. Moreover, the EU has also a number of rules and regulations governing the production, distribution, and marketing of organic products in the EU. The EU has really recently come with a new basic act, the regulation of 2018, laying the rules on organic production and labeling of organic products. And these are effective as from the 1st January of this year. Now, what is ITC doing about all these, regulations coming, and SMEs in developing countries have to comply with them? So we are working in several countries assisting enterprise to comply with the EU and other market requirements. We are doing a series of training on the EU regulations, on also other market requirements. At the policy and institutional level, ITC is strengthening the food control mechanism, which includes the regulatory framework, as well as institutions like testing laboratories, plant protection offices, food safety authorities, So we are building the capacity of, for example, so these conformity assessment bodies for testing pesticides, for certification, and getting them accredited so that they are recognized also more easily in the target markets. At the enterprise level, ITC is sensitizing enterprises on the EU regulations, as I have said, and other market requirements, including the voluntary sustainable standards and buyers standards. We are training and coaching SMEs to implement standards related to good agricultural practices, organic production, food safety systems, getting enterprise certified so that they can access international market. At the same time, we have an approach, a two-pronged approach. At the same time, we are building a network of potential trainers and advisors to sustain the effort to small enterprises. I'm referring here to the ITC Quality Champion Program, where we have included modules not only on quality management and food safety, but also on other modules related to sustainable development like environmental management, lean management, and energy management, which will be included very soon. Now, let me say a few words, on the topic of voluntary sustainability standards. ITC has been doing quite some work in this area with the standards mapping some 300 voluntary standards, voluntary sustainability standard with self-assessment tool. We have been supporting SMEs to implement these standards, and enterprises exporting to Europe, many in the fresh foods and vegetable sector have to comply with, for example, Global Gap. Recently, we have supported some 20 cooperatives in Kenya and Tanzania, for example, to be Global Gap certified. However, I have to say that with the proliferation of the voluntary sustainable standards, it has become very complex and even confusing for small businesses to comply with more than one standard for market access, not mentioning the relatively high costs, certification costs. And this is where international standards become important for better convergence on these sustainability requirements. This is what I have to say to your question, Victoria.
Thank you for sharing the range of activities and support mechanisms by ITC, and also just the range of standards, like we said, official, voluntary, EU, and beyond EU, which we will touch upon as well, in terms of how to help SMEs in developing countries to meet these new and old requirements. One thing that was mentioned at the beginning of presentation earlier was definitely the different levels at which rules and standards are set and governed. And at the multilateral level, there's obviously the WTO agreements on technical barriers to trade and the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which already provide as well measures for relating to product standards, food safety, conformity assessment procedures. Now, to what extent would you say, through your work, can the effective implementation of the WTO level provisions also help developing countries to comply with the EU level initiatives that we've heard of today?
Yes, thank you. Now, with the EU Green Deal, there will be a number of EU regulations that will be revised, and new ones will be elaborated. And here, the importance of implementation of the WTO TBT agreements, has become more than ever important, I would say. First, the transparency provisions of the WTO agreements on TBT and SPS are very pertinent and very useful. It is important that exporting countries are made aware of the changes being brought at an early stage and be able to voice out any challenges they may have to comply and eventually prepare themselves for compliance. Here, I would say the EPING tool of WTO and ITC is indeed very useful for tracking these notifications on new upcoming regulations. The national inquiry points have to play their part also. ITC has been supporting national inquiry points in several countries to become more effective, to be able to diffuse those notifications and also prepare response, working with operators and prepare response to the notification. The second thing I would say is that the WTO, TBT, and SPS committee will serve as effective platform to raise any trade concern related to new upcoming rules and regulations. This may also give some direction to the type of technical assistance to be provided to developing countries. Thirdly, I would say, as provided under the WTO, TBT agreements and SPS agreements, regulations, measures have to be based as far as possible on international standards. And here, the participation in the development of international standards becomes very important for developing countries, so that they may influence these international standards, because these are the standards that may be referred in regulations. These may be the standards that can give can help them to show demonstration to the market requirements. And perhaps I would add another point here. There is the provision of mutual recognition, where accreditation is very important. We are working in many countries where we are supporting certification bodies, testing laboratories for accreditation, so that the reports, the certificates can be more easily recognized in destination markets. Yeah, thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Kemaraj. If we move on from the level of SMEs and the work also that has been done to support in complying through enhancing business operations, demonstrating compliance, how about private sector as a collective? And here I turn to Chris. And the questions that have arose are obviously, how can business benefit? What can we do individually? But from your perspective, collectively, how do organizations such as the EU ASEAN Business Council, and how would you advise others to play a role in, by and large, smoothing the transition that is coming, but to promote activities that enhance green and sustainable trade and support businesses and SMEs in particular to get on the train and not miss the train, so to say?
It's a very good question. I mean, the Business Council is an advocacy body. If I look back to the slides that Paolo and Tobias put up earlier on the methodology, and Paolo was saying that there's one here, one particular one where you should be doing advocacy work. Actually, I would say we need to be playing in all 6 of those different levels on the methodology scale. I see the role of associations such as ourselves as being perhaps a 3-pronged approach. One is to inform and alert our members to what's coming down the pipeline if they don't already know, and then work with them and get their feeling and understanding, and then take those, their views, and then advocate on their behalf, particularly back to the Commission or indeed to any other government that's coming forward with similar legislation. The second prong is to engage with bilateral partners, with bilateral governments, other trade associations, and try and explain to them where the Commission is coming from. And it's not our job to explain what the Commission is doing, but sometimes we're often better placed to do so, and try and hopefully make them see what the Commission is up to as an opportunity and not a threat. And unfortunately, lots of the time they do see some of these things coming out from the EU as a threat. They don't see the good intention behind it, and what the Commission is doing is for all of our benefit. It's for the benefit of the planet and all of our futures. But it does sometimes come across as a bit like your grandmother telling you to wash behind your ears without giving you a good reason why, and also a bit protectionist is how it's seen in some parts of the world. And I think that the third prong for us as well is actually engaging the Commission and its various DGs and trying to encourage them to be a lot more communicative with their trade partners around the world, with other governments around the world, explain better what they're doing. I think there was a huge mistake on RED 2, where the Commission didn't explain what it was doing and lost the narrative completely with places like Indonesia and Malaysia, and was then forever playing catch up. And I do hope they've learned lessons from that and can get back ahead of the curve again on some of these new things that are coming out. So I think the role for us is really, it's one of communication, it's one of advocacy, it's getting involved very early on in the game, and it's then working with the various authorities, not just in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, here in Southeast Asia, to see what can be done to smooth it for businesses. And that's not just for European businesses, our members, but it's also for our members' supply chain providers as well, which is often right down to some very small MSMEs here in Southeast Asia who will get impacted by it. And I must say, I think to a large degree, our members do an awful lot of work with their supply chains to help explain things to them.
Thank you, Chris. What I took note of in particular, what you said was the perceptions, right, versus potentially the reality or intentions on the other side of these different initiatives. And I think in particular, and this was demonstrated as well in the flagship report by ITC, the SME competitiveness report on empowering green transition from last year, where we noticed, in fact, in particularly SMEs, how they're already facing challenges with existing requirements, but certainly the level of new initiatives, requirements that are coming will only amplify this problem potentially. So how would you say, perhaps from two perspectives, how do you ensure that SME perspectives are included in the advocacy work you do? And as a regional grouping, how do you ensure then that the interests in regional integration and connecting the region with markets outside ASEAN are in particularly taken into account in this endeavor?
Okay, I'll take the first one first. As a business council, we don't actually directly represent SMEs, but they are very important to our members. And actually, through our European Chamber membership, we do have outreach to a lot of SMEs. You're right. This sort of legislation that's coming out from Brussels or indeed from other jurisdictions is adding cost and complexity. And I think the key thing is actually that for SMEs, it is that their customers, which are often the larger MNCs, work very closely with them and help them out. And that's certainly true for a lot of European firms here in Southeast Asia. They are holding the hands of their suppliers to walk them through things like sustainability audits and what needs to be done. Because at the end of the day, it's the bigger firms which are having to do this. They're the ones that are being forced into doing it. And so they're going to have to work with their suppliers and make their life as easy as possible. Of course, the big risk is that there are added costs, there are added complexity. And when there's added cost, it ends up being all of us on this call who are going to pay it at the end of the day when we go to the cash register to buy our products. In terms of working with others and explaining things, there are two ways that governments in particular or foreign businesses can approach this issue. They can either take a very defensive stance or they can take a very innovative and proactive approach. We would always encourage the latter, of course, because at the end of the day, this is what we all need to do. We need to be working harder to green the planet, to prevent overheating and take action on the climate. Unfortunately, there is often a very protectionist stance being taken by governments elsewhere, and indeed by their companies, who then encourage the governments to take that protectionist stance. And we need to explain, as I just mentioned just now, what the opportunity is. And the opportunity is, if you work with the European Commission on this, first of all, they would help you. In many cases, they will provide capacity building. They will even, in some cases, provide cold, hard money to help with compliance. And also, it will create an opportunity for you, because if you don't start moving on some of these things, you will not be getting foreign direct investment into your country, because European firms and American firms and Japanese firms will not be able to make those investments going forward. And you will not be able to get access to the European market, at least, unless you're going to pay a very high price for it. And so they need to see the opportunity. And unfortunately as well, I think in much of the developing world, particularly here in Southeast Asia, we are very vulnerable to climate change issues, and governments should be already thinking about moving much faster than they already are.
Thank you, Chris, for that perspective. Perhaps Paolo and Tobias, may I invite you to react to some of the comments that have been made, and perhaps Jean-Sébastien as well, from your perspective in terms of how the EU is actually, through its trade-related technical assistance, working towards helping SMEs and developing countries more broadly in meeting these challenges. Paolo, over to you.
Victoria, thank you. No, I was going to add to what Chris said. There is one element that I think perhaps we should underline. If you look at the built-in process for the development of regulations and directives and legal instruments within the EU, there are a number of early entry points for various stakeholders to engage with the EU and let them know what their needs, worries, concerns, constraints are. If you look at the regular public consultation or civil society consultation, you will see that the vast majority of comments made, sometimes they're carbon copied, and we know that this is part of the game, but they're made by NGOs. And there's nothing wrong with that. NGOs are very important players in this, because a lot of the regulations that are being developed aim at protecting and achieving goals that are dear to us as citizens, consumers. Yeah, NGOs are at the forefront of that. But what I see missing, and it is an absolute, not tragedy, but it is very disappointing and unfortunate, is the early inputs of the business. Some companies do, some trade associations, councils, those with the structures, with the vision. Most others are nowhere to be seen. In telling early the European Union, and the European Union is doing these things just not to tick off the box, because they want to hear from people that are going to be affected. What are the problems? What are the problems of smallholders in a particular sector or commodity? What are the problems of the supply chain, of SMEs, MSMEs? What are the needs? And so I totally relate to what Chris was saying. His perspective, as he mentioned, of course, is that of the bigger companies, but they rely often on SMEs. But the SMEs, MSMEs, down to individual companies, are not engaging early. And this is why we made this point in our methodology. And perhaps that's where there should be a built-in facility through technical assistance, through development partners, through international organizations, to gather those elements, to make them known early, so that we don't end up having to litigate at the WTO or suffer for years to comply with regulations which are distorted, unfair to a degree. Yeah, because, and I conclude, my point is that if the system overall does not understand that there needs to be carrots, as many carrots as possible, not just a few carrots and many sticks, these measures will not work to change the world we live in. There needs to be an economic incentive to be sustainable. And that comes through measures that factor that in. It comes through trade facilitative solutions. That's our stress on finding bilateral or regional tools to work together and give some preferential market access to some countries or some producers so that they are incentivized to be sustainable. And if you look at the way the EU is now moving towards this idea of trade and sustainable development chapters in its preferential trade agreements, having some sanction mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms, but also an economic dimension whereby they would provide preferential market access to those that comply with sustainability. That, I think, is a very good development, and one that I hope countries will work with the EU to achieve, and to make sure that, again, there are incentives at being sustainable, not just compliance and requirements to adhere to. Maybe I stop there for now. Thanks, Victoria.
Paola, and I'll come back to you with a few questions related to FTAs and special treatment for developing countries that were asked as it relates to your comment. I would perhaps give Jean-Sébastien the floor to kind of build on the work through which EU is in fact addressing the gap in advocacy and other ways in which business should be involved from the start.
Thanks, Victoria. Before, I'd like to make 2 points. One, regarding the, we've been talking about sustainable supply chain, and here it seems that there's a lot of, the burden seems to be on the private sector, through these due diligence processes. But from an investor point of view, one may also want to think about how to de-risk this, global or value chain by also in the countries that are exporting towards the EU not only rely on the private sector initiative, but maybe also provide a proper regulatory framework in the country so that investors, may decide as to where they want to invest in order to locate their suppliers. What I'm trying to say is that if in a country they risk the environment by making sure, for instance, that the country implements the ILO's conventions and other international conventions related to environment, that may also create a prima facie, if I may say so, trust for investors and also for the EU investigators to make sure that actually imports coming from this country are more likely to comply with the new requirements that the EU is willing to go by. So just to say that even though there is a due diligence element in it, countries may also want to see from their own perspective whether they can facilitate this trust of EU importers. That is one. Second, yes, you mentioned perception. It's true that in the context of all these initiatives, sometimes the intentions are not properly understood. Just to illustrate this point, for instance, in the ongoing discussion at the EU level with respect to the debate on textile, where they are also trying to put in place, the EU is discussing whether more space should be given for the private sector to self-regulate by coming up with voluntary standards, or whether it should go, with firmer standard using potentially global standard. There is a question about voluntary standard can be compliant with, say, WTO requirements, but in fact, the question is whether from an environmental point of view, whether it is efficient. So that's also a dimension that is actually being discussed at the EU. I think the EU is very much also trying to look at it from an environmental point of view, how efficient the measures which are being put on the table are or not. So that's a dimension that also is very much in the mind of the EU, and sometimes it might be ill-interpreted. Finally, what ITC can do, if we look at this framework that Paolo mentioned, we are very much supporting developing countries, chambers of commerce of those countries and LDCs to be aware of this development. And today is one initiative, but we are doing far more than that. So to understand, to keep an eye on those developments. Secondly, on advocacy, yes, we are also very much supporting countries to advocate their views, their interests, working with chambers of commerce, assisting them with coming up with evidence-based position papers, whether it is to also inform their own policymakers to understand their views, their interests, but also trying to build bridges with the EU-based chambers of commerce so that their positions are also conveyed through this channel. And finally, the third, I would say, layer is negotiate. As Paolo mentioned, yes, there are some trade facilitative solutions that can be negotiated in order to address some of the challenges that may stem from these new regulations. And we're also very much supporting countries in their negotiations, whether it is in the context of FTAs or bilateral ad hoc channels. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Sébastien. Paolo or Tobias, would you like to actually take up on this, the point of the FTAs that Jean-Sébastien mentioned at the end? So how can, specific question came in on how can free trade agreements with the EU, I'm sure many representatives here and participants come from countries where they have the FTUs, how can they come to the aid of the developing countries in gradually undertaking these standards? I would like to hear your views on what role FTAs can play broadly in such a process and benefit developing countries. Could you address that, please?
Yeah, Tobias, if you allow me, perhaps I'll give it a crack first. And this is a good question, and it's one that is dear to us because we have seen FTAs work in favor of certain sectors and countries. Obviously, not all countries have FTAs with the EU, but those that have or are negotiating them, I would encourage them to find solutions to specific problems. Sector-specific chapters can be negotiated that allow for mutual recognition so that the authorities of two countries are able to certify and be recognized in that certification against and towards compliance with the technical regulations or the standards of the importing country. equivalency. I mean, obviously, it's difficult to achieve equivalency vis-a-vis mutual recognition, but that's a bit the holy grail in a way. And bilaterally, it's easier to achieve than in a multilateral context. Consider that a preferential trade agreement, which meets the requirements of the WTO, would allow for that type of bilateral, sometimes region to region, preference. That's the carrot that I was referring to, that would otherwise be WTO illegal to be worked out and to be packaged. And I think that this should serve not just the interests of the typical actors in trade that want reduced tariffs or tariff rate quotas open so that they can trade into a particular country at a preferential level, but it should also be a regulatory type of preference. Our systems align, there is harmonization, there is equivalency, there is mutual recognition. Our products can be traded at an advantage vis-a-vis those of others. That should in itself be a very good objective to achieve. And I think it could be the solution to a lot of the problems and irritants and problems we are seeing coming out of these new requirements, new compliance requirements and due diligence requirements in relation to sustainability and environmental protection. Consider also that it is what we have already seen in large part. For example, under flagged, a voluntary partnership agreement is exactly that. Now, I would suggest that perhaps it's not as WTO compliant as one which would be lowered in a preferential trade agreement. IUU is the same, but those were largely dictated unilaterally by the EU. The EU said, these are the requirements you comply with, and we help you comply with, and we engage with you to comply, or you stay out of the market. We are suggesting something different. It's a bilateral agreement between two countries that aim at facilitating trade, having understood that there are certain important requirements to achieve sustainability, environmental protection, circularity that are being pursued also bilaterally. So I'm very much in favor and a fan of preferential trade agreements if used properly. I think they could be a powerful force also for sustainability.
And perhaps, Victoria, just to briefly add to what Paolo said, and perhaps take it to a bit of a higher level. We've heard also in the Q&A a lot of concerns that stakeholders have the impression that they are not being heard by the European Union, that they are not able to make their positions clear. And trade negotiations, be it for preferential trade agreements or updates thereto, or in any other context, they provide a unique opportunity where negotiators at a technical level, as well as at a political level, come together. They provide an opportunity to convey concerns, to convey positions, to address bilateral trade irritants. And one example is the EU-Japan trade agreement. It's an agreement between two developed countries, yes, but it was not about tariffs. It was about non-tariff measures that were addressed as part of the negotiations. And ultimately, the removal of non-tariff measures is what helps the SMEs, because if those rules are aligned, harmonized, if trade irritants are resolved, it will make it easier for the big players, but much more importantly, also for the SMEs, the MSMEs, that benefit much more from the removal of those little irritants that the big players don't need to care about, but that are really burdensome, cumbersome for the SMEs. And the trade negotiations are the ideal forum to address those issues, resolve the issues, and ensure market access opportunities into the EU.
Thank you, Paolo and Tobias, for that overview. I was wondering, in terms of the question related to special treatment, as you discussed some of the preferential agreements here. What is the level of built-in flexibilities in the green initiatives that you presented that you could highlight at this stage? Again, specifically targeting SMEs. Are there some that, again, participants on the webinar can really target as the kind of quick wins or first mover solutions when it comes to where in negotiations they can target these kinds of special treatments?
Yeah, perhaps I give it a first go, but if you look at one of the most recent instruments, the regulation on due diligence for deforestation and forest degradation, there are different tracks of future compliance with the requirements, and obviously SMEs or companies that are below certain turnover thresholds would have a delayed implementation. Tobias has mentioned, and we've mentioned in the presentation, that this on its face obviously looks good, and understanding of the realities of SMEs, MSMEs. But in as much, of course, as those SMEs or MSMEs were to be part of the supply chain of a company that is immediately affected, they would have to be part of the due diligence process. And so they would be also affected earlier. So I think there are instances where the EU, I think, genuinely tries to understand and cater for the needs of the smaller players in the course of trade. But there is perhaps more that could be done there, not just with the traditional, typical delayed delayed implementation periods or transitional periods for implementation. I think there should be more assistance. But again, to me, this can only be nurtured and accommodated if there is earlier dialogue and understanding of the needs of SMEs. They're not always the same. It's not just about kicking the can down the road and getting 2 extra years. It is to understand what the requirements are, be supported in introducing elements in the way they function as organizations, as business organizations, to be able to meet those requirements when they happen. Otherwise, there is also the risk that the bigger players, which typically complain about but not dislike regulation because they can comply with it, will progressively deal with the bigger players, and that will trigger more concentration, SMEs having to give up on business or merging into others. So there are some unintended, perhaps, macroeconomic consequences to some of these policies that I think should be understood and accommodated.
Thank you, Paolo. Chris, did you like to build on that?
He really does highlight the need for the private sector at all levels, SMEs and MNCs, to engage very early in the process. There is a tendency in governments anywhere, not just in Brussels, for officials to sit in their offices and come up with great ideas and write directives or legislation, and then it just comes out without thinking about what the consequences of that might be in real terms, in the real world, on real people. And I think it's our job as a trade association and business council to make sure they understand what the consequences are and what they're coming up with, and try and make sure that legislation, for whatever its good intent, can be implemented in a fair and reasonable way at a fair and reasonable cost, and achieve what it is meant to achieve without having undue nasty impacts on SMEs, on business, on trade, or indeed in diplomacy.
Thank you, Chris. And I guess that just underscores again the importance of private sector to be part at every stage, from the awareness to the monitoring to the assessment as well of the different proposals that are put forward, given the unintended consequences that you just mentioned, Chris. In the spirit of the forward-looking ideal of these webinars, one question that was highlighted was regarding the EU taxonomy. So something that is progressing and is being put in place at the EU level. And question was, how does it have an impact, if any, on trading partners, SMEs in the regions that you operate in? Chris, you provided an answer, but perhaps if you could build on that, and Paolo, Tobias as well, add to it, so that, again, businesses can keep abreast on what's to come and how it may impact them in the future.
Yeah, sure. So to explain a bit more of the background, the EU taxonomy is a guiding principle for sustainable finance. So for finance houses, asset owners, banking institutions to make investments and have them tagged as being green, they need to make sure they're hitting the standards inside the EU taxonomy. And that's all investments, whether it's be large scale ones like building a new airport or building a railway line, or indeed smaller investments, perhaps in energy efficiency programs for smaller companies anywhere in the world. The key thing is here, other parts of the world are coming up with their own taxonomies. ASEAN came up with their own last November, which is pretty good. It's not that different from the EU's one, which is a bit of a godsend, because if you're a finance house, you don't want to be navigating multiple different taxonomies to make your investments and get the badge saying that it's a green investment. You want to be dealing, hopefully, one set of harmonized taxonomies around the world. They become very, very important though, going forward. I can't now think of a major European or indeed American investment institution which these days is saying that they will be investing in things that aren't green or aren't heading towards being green. And I think this is vital for everyone to understand. So taxonomies everywhere become very, very important, as indeed does the need to have a harmonized approach on ESG reporting and ESG standards as well. And you know, E is very important, but we shouldn't forget the social and the governance part of this equation at the same time. I mean, talking about sustainability audits for things like labor rights in your supply chains, that hits on the governance part of that and on the social part of it as well. So they do become very, very important. The EU taxonomy is not quite the global standard, but it's certainly a benchmark for the world to be looking at, and others will be following it very, very closely.
Thank you, Chris. Tobias or Paolo, did you want to add to it?
Oh, I would only add, first of all, that I concur with Chris completely, but I would add that we should all expect leadership and responsible behavior by governments when it comes to these issues, and to all of us being able to speak and understand the same language. I don't think that this should be down to private sector inputs. Of course, the private sector benefits, but I think governments have to understand that this common language is a basic requirement. You know, think trading services. The idea that most countries would still have their own different classifications of services is perhaps an equivalent to what we're seeing here. We need to have a basic language that we can all speak, even before we can start thinking of minimizing trade impacts, finding trade facilitative solutions and others. So I think that this is an area where there needs to be an assumption of responsibilities by governments and WTO members around the world to achieve that element of uniformity. Otherwise, it will be a mess.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paolo. Now, looking at the time, I would like to give the opportunity for potentially final rounds of comments by panelists, and particularly lace them with actionable recommendations that you've made, but potentially make them even more concrete in the form of short-term, medium-term, long-term. Where do participants need to keep their focus on as it relates to new, developing, prospective initiatives? And following that, I would like to also invite Rajesh Agarwal, the Director of Division of Markets Development at ITC, also to provide some kind of rounding up, concluding thoughts to what we've heard this morning and the way forward as we follow with the ensuing webinars. So perhaps at this stage, if I may pass over to you, Jean-Sébastien, and then to Kemaraj and to our distinguished panelists.
Well, if I may say, the immediate next step would be to invite you to attend our next webinar, which will happen in a couple of weeks' time from now. And then there will be a third one so that you stay tuned and you keep having the pulse on what's happening in the EU level. We are very much willing to continue this endeavor to keep increasing, or sustaining this awareness endeavor to the benefit of the chambers of commerce and also the policymakers of developing countries and LDCs on all these EU initiatives, which will definitely have an impact on exporters of those countries. That is very much what we would like to do. We would also like to, in all our projects, we will certainly be willing to support the advocacy endeavor that is to be shaped in line of the discussion of today. So we have a number of projects going on where we are willing to sustain this advocacy for trade and environment-related issues, sustainability, circularity. Of course, we do have all the other projects in the house who are aiming at supporting these other pillars that we mentioned today. Compliance, very much so with my colleague Kemraj and other colleagues in Itc, which is certainly something that a lot of questions reflected today. Yes, I think this is what we would like to propose, and we'll be very happy to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Sébastien. Over to you, Kemraj.
Thank you, Victoria. So on my side, I'll have to stress on two things, very important. Given that there are new regulations coming, it is important to sensitize the SMEs. Many of them in developing countries are not enough aware of the changes, the impact of the changes. And it is very important to make them understand what is coming with the new policies, EU policies. And then, I won't stop saying that, developing countries have to increase their participation in the formulation of international standards, because these will be tools for compliance. And they have to participate actively in formulating these international standards, because the regulations, many of these regulations will be based on international standards. And this is the opportunity to influence these international standards. And also, another thing is that we have to build the technical infrastructure in the developing countries. And what we have found so far in the developing countries, the technical infrastructure to support enterprises for compliance is quite weak in many countries, and we need to continuously provide support to have, effective and efficient infrastructure, technical infrastructure, quality infrastructure, SPS infrastructure to support enterprises for compliance. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Kemraj. Chris.
I've got 5 words, I think, try and sum it up. Engage, discuss, advocate, communicate, and assist. And I think that applies at all levels. The European Commission needs to make sure that it is engaging with its trading partners around the world. It's discussing its ideas and proposals with them. It needs to advocate for the benefits that they can bring, but it needs to communicate much better than it has done in the past with its partners. And then it needs to provide assistance and to be better than they are in many areas. And here in Southeast Asia, a lot of help going into energy transition work, for instance. But that engage, discuss, advocate, communicate, assist also applies to organizations such as myself. It applies to the large MNCs. It applies to NGOs. It applies to law firms. It applies to ITC. It applies to all of us. We all have a role to play in this, in making sure that what's being done is understood, what's being done is being communicated properly, that the voices are being heard of those that are mostly affected by it. But at the end of the day, we all work together to help each other out, to make sure that we are doing the right things to prevent climate change from getting worse.
Thank you, Chris. We have quite a list of items and work cut out for ourselves. Thank you. How about Tobias and Paolo?
Perhaps I take a step first, and first of all, thanks for today. I think I personally enjoyed it, and I hope that many of the participants also will walk away with some food for thought. My recommendation would be, especially to them, I can imagine a lot of the small companies, operators, traders, producers, especially in developing countries, perhaps having a bit of a headache after today, having seen how many of these regulatory initiatives are coming potentially their way. I would say keep it simple. understand what is coming your way, and if it is something you need to worry about. And look, there is a lot of information available online. If there's one thing which is really good about the European Union is how transparent it is from early in the days when these things are being conceived. So try to understand the awareness we talked about and Chris just mentioned. Understand what is going to happen. The information is largely available. Do a quick impact assessment. How is that going to impact you and your business? And when you have those two elements and you keep an eye on the progress of legislation, you can determine what you should do to prepare to comply or to advocate, to tell the European Union, tell your government, what are your worries, your concerns, your needs, yeah? And your government, I'm sure, will find it natural to work with other governments, to work with international organizations, with the EU, to ensure that you get some help and that your needs, your concerns are understood and accommodated. And ultimately, of course, you'll have to comply. And that's going to be costly, but there are advantages and possible opportunities to be exploited. If you are among the first, you'll have access to a market which is really important and lucrative. So again, it's our methodology, but I would say start small, work your way into some of these impacts, and know that there is a lot of help available. ITC does a lot. There is other development partners. If you have the money, you can even pay advisors and consultants and lawyers to help you. But do be curious and do have an interest and do start early. That would be my advice. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Paolo, for those practical advices. Tobias, did you want to come in for?
Very briefly, I think be prepared, be aware of what's happening, start scratching the surface as we've done today in the presentation, but then as you find something that is of relevance for your trade, for your products, go deeper, seek help, be it your trading partners in the EU, be it any trade association, business association, development partners, your own governments that can engage with the European Union at a technical and diplomatic level. Make use of the tools that are there, and then there's a way to comply and to keep trading.
Thank you, Tobias. Now, just to take a moment, Paolo mentioned that all of this information can easily produce a headache. We certainly hope that this webinar didn't produce a headache to anybody. If it did, however, there's a way to alleviate it, which is to participate in the next 2 webinars that will be organized around some of these topics, digging deep and looking at some of the practical recommendations coming out of it. And in preparing for those webinars, we will run a short poll now during Prajesh's remarks for you to tick the different levels or areas of interest that you have of topics that we could address and discuss in further depth in the 2 remaining webinars. So that will pop up in just a short moment. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Rajesh for your concluding thoughts.
Thank you very much, Victoria. First, let me say that I enjoyed this webinar, very rich webinar. So much of information has come out of it, and I must place on record my extreme gratitude and thanks to all the distinguished panelists who could actually reach out on a very complicated subject to such a vast audience. This brings me, I was noticing that at one point in time, there were 100+ participants from all over the world. This attests to the fact that climate change issues are getting to the center of our development debate these days. And that is why all that interest that we have seen. And it is here that in the International Trade Center, ITC, we are focusing on building carbon competitiveness of SMEs. And this webinar was part of that series to start that process, how we take it forward. I know, and you have raised it, even the chat box is full of it in a way, change is always difficult and challenging. And I think to make that change happen as smoothly as possible, that's where as an organization, we are stepping in to help SMEs to overcome the challenges and seize the opportunities. Conservatively put, retain the existing market access, but we would even help them to get to even additional market access opportunities through this transition. What we don't want is that SMEs keep complaining. We want to avoid that situation. What happens is that we keep on flying the red flag, standing on the platform when the train actually takes off. And then, the train doesn't even look at that the red flag is flying there. We don't want SMEs to be in that situation. That's where we stand. And I think we in ITC had done also an SME survey. I need not get into the results of that survey because your discussion and the questions have vindicated what we found in that survey in a way. So what is required? The first step, all the panelists have said, let me repeat, understanding, understanding, understanding. At least understand, don't just go by the perceptions of something good or bad. First, let's get into the detail and understand. And I think the first seminar, this is beginning of the process of understanding. And I'm already which will be subject to obviously the suggestions you give, will lay down that where we want to go. Second is after understanding, undertaking, first at the business level. How can you reduce your carbon footprint? I think we will find the ways and helping enterprises to reduce that footprint. And Hemraj would have said, and that's extremely important. How do we demonstrate that compliance? There are many issues in that. And obviously, like other TBT measures, SPS measures, which are governing the normal trade, and SPS and the SMEs are so much concerned about it. And we have, for the last 15 years, even we and other organizations are working towards it. I think additional layer is now added in which for environmental regulations, we will have to create the quality infrastructure and the capacity to demonstrate compliance. Now comes the last, thing in this sector. Why this change is a bit difficult? Because it needs money. I think Paulo had already mentioned. It needs technology. So acquisition of technology, access to finance, capacity building, understanding, these are all elements which will facilitate this change. Ultimately, we need to work towards transitioning to green economy. And here, whether it is trade policy, whether it is investment policy, it is the sustainable goals, these are the methods in a coherent way, which will help us get proper investments, get to energy efficiency, get to resource efficiency, including circularity of trade policies also. All this will relate to the trade policies. What are the tariffs on those capital goods which can help in acquiring technology? Are there licensing agreements? Can there be an investment attraction for transition to greening? I think towards the third webinar, we would like to get to those kind of details which can help you ultimately to transition towards a green economy. Many issues on carbon border adjustment will crop up when you start demonstrating. I think we need to understand, delve deep into the issues which are there for compliance, for measurement, which will ultimately become the key for even demonstrating. And all, Paulo had already mentioned, there has to be equivalence and there has to be harmonization and bilateral agreements and regional agreements. All these kind of things will become important once we understand those issues. And we are proposing, again, I keep on saying, subject to, whatever suggestions you will give for going forward. I think we will delve deep in the next webinar on all these issues relating to carbon border adjustment mechanism as well. So here I stop by saying we have made a beginning. We are beginning to understand. We are identified issues about certification, demonstration of the environmental regulations. Then let's delve deep into carbon border adjustment mechanism and all the issues around it. And then finally, in the third webinar, get down to all elements of investment policy, trade policy, industrialization strategy, sustainability goals, etc., to be fashioned in a coherent way for smooth green transition of the economies. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you, Rajesh, for bringing us to the wider context and underscoring still the different streams of challenges that we will tackle in the next few webinars. Now, you will have seen popped up a poll for you to answer when it comes to the thematic areas and topics of particular interest. As Rajesh mentioned, this is only the beginning. We're beginning with a 3-part series, but Lord knows how much more there might be with the kind of breadth and depth of the topic that we have tried to address today. So kindly respond to this particular poll as soon as you can. And just to alert as well that at the end of the webinar, there will be a separate evaluation survey for you to swiftly comment and answer some questions that will help us also to prepare for the ensuing events. Now, as you respond to these questions, I would like to thank very much our distinguished panelists for the huge task they had today. Thank you to Rajesh for being here, setting us in context, and Jean-Sébastien as well. And thank you for Vidya, who is putting together this event and all the upcoming webinars here at ITC. And in the meantime, please stay tuned on ITC website, on social media, on all other platforms where you will find how ITC is aiming to address the issues of discussion today. And we very much look forward to reconnecting with you in just 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, and we will keep this platform open for you to still respond to these questions that you will see on the screen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.